Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we are talking with Daniela Parker about third-party risk management and vendor risk management. Daniela, great first segment there. I promised I'd get back to this question. So how do we do these evaluations?
So I usually start by risk rating the vendor, right? Again, what is the vendor doing for us? What is the operational impact? What's the contract value? Are they getting sensitive data from us? And if so, how many records? Because that does make a difference as well. What's their reliance on other third parties? It is part of a factor. So I usually factor all these pieces in, and then we have a risk rating. And that risk rating kind of determines not necessarily the type of information we ask for, but the frequency, right? Because to me, vendor management or vendor due diligence, you can't do that one time and be done with because vendors have changes and you want to evaluate that on an ongoing basis because you might get blindsided otherwise. And then we ask for documentation. Depending on, if you use a tool, what industry you work in, some places have questionnaires with like 300 something questions that the vendors have to fill out. And good luck if you're a smaller organization on getting vendors to actually do that, right? But so you have questionnaires where they have to answer all these questions and then they provide documentation. They usually very standard for financial services is the SOC report, right? Where we want to see what is their information security posture, their financials. We do research on are they in any lawsuits or is there anything out in the open about that vendor. We may ask for information security policies. A lot of it is focused, especially financial services, on the InfoSec piece. And so we ask for that documentation, we assess it, we see what jumps out at us, and then we provide a risk assessment at the end of it to whoever has to sign the contract. And then the other piece to it for me has always been the contract review, right? Because the contract also needs to be reviewed. And depending on, again, the risk that the vendor brings to the table, or especially technology vendors, you want to have an attorney review the contract, even though a lot of people think they're attorneys, but they're
Right.
not, right? And so to me, it's always twofold. You review the actual vendor based on the documents and the questionnaire, whatever process you use, and then the contract plays a role in your vendor due diligence as well, because that's where you transfer risk and that's where you understand the liability, and that's where all those components come in.
What happens, you find you've got your report and you've identified a few things that are concerning.
Mhm.
Should we just kind of write that vendor off? Or should we, go back and say, hey, can you provide more details? We don't quite understand this, or we found a gap. Because I know, it's very quick in today's world. Oh, no, this is a problem, so forget it.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, they just provided the wrong answer.
Yeah, I would definitely go back. The vendors are really partners, right? They're supposed to be partners to the organization. They're supposed to help us solve a problem. And so having a conversation with the vendor a lot of times can resolve things. And then again, bringing the right people in. When it's technical in nature, I always would bring in the InfoSec folks or the IT folks and really understanding, what is it that we're concerned about and what can the vendor provide to help us alleviate that. And then also, if the vendor can't, but we're kind of set on working with them, what can we do internally? It takes more than just your vendor management folks. It takes everybody, like on the IT side, on the InfoSec side, to kind of partake in that. But I would always ask the vendor. Those
Mhm.
questionnaires are pretty hefty. And so, and a lot of times, it's an easy answer. Oh, yeah, we have that document. Or yes, it's addressed here. Or no, you misinterpreted what I provided to you. Always,
Yeah.
always have that conversation. Yeah.
Now, I can't help but ask this question. How come we ask all these vendors to ask questions that sometimes our own organizations are unwilling to provide?
So you're probably thinking about business continuity plans in particular, where we usually get the, well, we'll give you an executive summary. Personally, again, I'm back at, I don't really care that you have a document as a vendor that says business continuity plan. You and I know that the plan isn't the battle, right? Like that's not, the plan is the plan. I would much rather ask a vendor to say, let's test something together. Now that's obviously after we've engaged with them. But prior to that ask, I would ask for tests. I would ask more for like very specific questions based on situations rather than asking for that plan document, I wouldn't hand it over either. Every business continuity plan I've ever seen says, it's sensitive. You don't share that outside of the organization. And so again, to me, vendor management isn't a one size fits all. It should be very individualized because maybe a vendor doesn't support a critical process. Then do you really care about that? Is it really important? Maybe because regulation says you have to assess that, but then figure out how to assess that differently. That plan document isn't going to solve it.
That's exactly what I was going to ask next. What if some things are not applicable? What do we do?
Well, again, to me, it's always been as long as it's documented, right? And being in a regulated industry, it was always, the examiners are going to want to see it, the examiners are going to want to see it. But to me, it's always been I can document how I made that decision or how I assess the risk. And again, if the vendor then gives me an executive summary and that's all they're going to provide, then that's my documentation. But I would definitely ask more questions, right? Take the executive summary, check that box, and then really do the work on assessing how ready are they or how prepared are they? Are they going to be there when you actually need them to, right? That's always been my approach.
You think sometimes, and I think it's because you just said the word tick box, that sometimes these assessments just become tick box exercises and people don't really understand what questions to really follow up with.
Part of it is that. The other piece to keep in mind is that for me, it's always been just because we know the vendor like has certain documents, again, does that actually mean that they provide a higher level of security than a vendor that doesn't have a certain document, right? So looking at it more holistically, you have to go and collect your documents. And sometimes these documents tell a story, especially when you do your ongoing due diligence. If you see that a vendor is declining in financial health, you want to pay some attention to that, right? But at the end of the day, it's a bigger picture question. How does the vendor interact with my organization? And so, to me, the documents play a role. It should not just be a checkbox exercise, but there's a limit to what you're going to get out of the documents.
And what do we do with these documents once we've got them?
We
They,
save them.
sorry?
We save them.
How often should we look at them?
Depends on the risk, right? If it's a high risk vendor, so if they have access, say they have access to all your data, or they support a super critical process for you, probably annually. Should definitely keep an eye on it annually. If they are having problems, right? Maybe more frequently, maybe they're on a watch list. That's also where your vendor performance management comes in, like really making sure that your organization, if there's incidents with a vendor, if you say, for example, you outsource a call center and you get a lot of complaints from a service perspective, make sure that that's documented, how they're performing, right? Because that's ultimately going to allow you to see if there's any problems on the horizon. Also keeping in mind that replacing a vendor, depending on what they do for you, can take a couple of years. If you're needing to replace a large vendor that requires like a big conversion, that takes time. So you have to be forward looking. And for example, I would always put one of my questions in the vendor due diligence was always, how long would it take you to replace this vendor? And then that was a reminder in the calendar for that contract owner to say, are we happy with this vendor? Or are we wanting to look at possibly replacing that vendor? Because if that's the case, now is the time that you need to start. So again, it's a bigger picture, right? Vendor due diligence and you have vendor performance management.
A couple of questions. This is why I love talking with you because brain just starts going away like, oh, yeah, 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 at that point. You mentioned testing together. What kind of testing together and what is it we should be testing?
Well, failover capabilities, for example, right? Again, I can draw on, I mean, I've almost 25 years in financial services, doing a failover with your core provider and saying, can we actually actively fail over and operate out of a second data center? And then what you need to test with them is maybe it's even a responsiveness. Sometimes it's calling a number that you have for them and seeing is anybody actually going to answer, right? Or who all gets access to certain things when you call them. I've tested that too, user access, right? Those pieces. But it really depends on what the services that they provide or the product that they support, and really honing in on, can they meet what your internal RTOs are? I'll give you an example. Online banking usually has a very short RTO for a financial services, organization. If your contract says 24 hours, then that's your RTO. So, don't think that you're going to have it back in 4 hours if your contract says 24. So, A, paying attention to that, and then maybe that's what you're testing, right? Can they actually meet that?
Are there any challenges with that? Because, and the reason being is I'm asking from experience, wanted to test some things with a vendor and they said, no, it's too sensitive.
Put it in the
I
contract
didn't
if
get
you
it.
can,
I didn't quite understand it myself because I'm going, well, wait a second, we're doing business with you.
right?
So how could it be too sensitive for us to work together?
So that's something that should happen during the vendor selection, right? Again, back to maybe your RFP, right? If you're saying we want to have in the contract, and I'm very idealistic when it comes to this stuff, but I think that at the very least, you need to ask, what's the worst that can happen? They say no. So you ask the question and say, it's really important for us that you're able to recover quickly. We would like to put something in the contract that says we get to test with you, and here's what this looks like on an annual basis. Again, if you're a small organization, that could be challenging, but maybe it's not. At least ask, right? And if you
Yes.
can't, then, figure out how to address that from a liability perspective, from an insurance perspective, right? Figure out how you can address that.
Yeah, I remember working for one organization and we were trying to test with our partners. It's scheduled 2 years out because
Oh,
there were
wow.
so many people involved, so many data
Yeah.
centers involved, just to get it on the schedule and find everyone's available. We had to plan 2 years out to do it.
Yeah, but if as long as nothing happens in those 2 years, at least in
Yeah.
2 years, you'll know if it works or not.
Yeah, fingers crossed nothing did, by the way.
Good.
Uh, the other thing you mentioned about replacing a vendor. So how do you go about keeping a current vendor honest then, knowing that because our organizations, we have change. We'll always have change.
Yeah.
Well, so do they. So how do we keep them honest so that we know what's changing on their side that may have impacted us and we don't even know?
So that's your ongoing due diligence, right? That's why you can't just do that at the beginning. You actually have to take a look at your vendors more frequently. Like I said, annually. You also should probably pay attention, especially the large vendors. Pay attention to the news. If a vendor has a problem,
Mhm.
if you're following, your industry journals or whatever, a lot of times you hear about that. You'll hear if someone gets bought out, if someone files for bankruptcy. So you do need to pay a little bit of attention. You just scan your environment just a tad bit. But then the ongoing due diligence, and then also being in touch with your vendor. I'm usually on the receiving end of that, and you usually only get to talk to the salespeople. But when they hit you up at budget time, maybe that's when you can ask the question and say, so what's changed in your organization? And then also ask the people that actually own the contracts to say, hey, when you're talking to your vendors, could you just let me know if there's substantial changes? And here's why. Here's why I need to know, right? So I can help you better manage that relationship. But yeah, you have to just pay attention. And this is back to, don't look at it as a one and done. Managing your vendors is an ongoing process. It's not just we're going to collect documents and then off we go. It's ongoing, just like so many of the things we do.
Yeah. You mentioned look at things annually, but what if I've got an organization with lots and lots of vendors and partners that I'm dealing with? Is reviewing contracts annually really doable? So is like, what's the best way of being able to do that
So
effectively?
I wouldn't review the contracts necessarily. I would pay it unless they're up for renewal, right? But your vendor due diligence documents, and then again, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. But say you always want to have an updated SOC, usually, right? If there's data involved. Pay like again, it doesn't have to be a long list of things, but if again, this vendor supports a critical process, Maybe that's the thing you look at if they share, their business continuity plan with them. Maybe that's the thing you ask for. Where's your annual testing documented, right? Like, what have you done? And so, in a lot of organizations, vendor management, similar to business continuity, it's like 25% of someone's job, not understanding how critical vendors can be to your success. I mean, they can be, right? You can outsource some of it. If you can at least outsource the document gathering, that's a big pain because vendors are like, meh, especially the ongoing due diligence, they're like, I'll send them when I send them. But like figure out if you can outsource some of it and then again make it based on risk. Not every vendor has to have annual review. You want to risk rate them maybe every other year. Maybe they have like zero impact on your organization and it's back to why are you working with them? But maybe then you don't do that. But I would definitely, it's not a one size fits all. You risk rate them and then you make decisions based on what they support, what they provide, and what you can handle. That's that's definitely, from a resource perspective, like this is how much I can get done. And then organization, if you're okay with me not reviewing these vendors, then that's okay. If you're not, I need some resources.
I guess it's, I couldn't help but think of the example. You're going to be more aware and paying a lot more attention to, let's say, your internet service provider and
Hmm.
really focusing on them than you are with the people that come in and change the mats by the front door. That
Yes.
vendor. You're going to
Hmm.
rate them and look at them a little bit differently, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And then that, so you have to focus where your risk is. That's
Yeah.
ultimately it. Yeah.
On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with Daniela Parker today, and we will be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.